I think the first part of this conversation that we've had so far has just been kind of just like restating why Ethereum is important, why we're all here, why we align with this project that has this grand arc that we've been following for years and years. And this idea of just like unlocking property rights for the internet has like pilled so many people. It's why we have this podcast. It's why you're at the EF. Really great like foundation for, I think, what we want to talk about next, because there has been some parts of the Ethereum roadmap that I think haven't been formally like integrated into a lot of people's mental models that have been developed in the past. Like we have the triple point asset, we have ultrasound money, rollup-centric roadmap, and we haven't really integrated rollups very well in our content sphere on Bankless yet, as it relates to this idea of property rights or the property rights layer of the internet. Or, you know, said differently, we haven't really integrated how do rollups fit into like the value accrual mechanisms for ETH. Now that we have a rollup-centric roadmap, how does that change the triple point asset or like ultrasound money? So I think that's what we want to do. And then this next part of this conversation is like really unpack in 2024, what do rollups do to these pre-established mental models that we've covered so much in the past? And so maybe we can start with there. How do rollups expand Ethereum block space? And is that also the same thing as expanding Ethereum's property rights system? Because we have two different things here. We have property rights, and then we have Ethereum block space. I don't know if those are one-to-one equivalent. Are those the same things? Are those different? And overall, like how do rollups fit into this like model for understanding Ethereum?
First and foremost, we should consider how the L2 consumption of Ethereum block space imbues some similar censorship-resistant, seizureship-resistant properties on L2 assets. And kind of fundamentally, how I think about this is the rollups are effectively represented, some of their state is represented on Ethereum as this canonical bridge. And the assets that live in that Ethereum space are able to be used in the rollups because when you are sure that your rollup assets have the same censorship-resistant properties that they would have on Ethereum L1, right? So there's kind of two components to this. First, there's becoming a stage 2 rollup, and we can maybe talk about some of the details there, maybe not, but this is kind of around the details of the smart contract bridge itself and who has the permission to upgrade the bridge, who has permission to upgrade the state. These are fundamentally things about like the representation of the assets in the bridge and how those assets can be withdrawn. The second thing is the kind of forced withdrawal mechanism from L2 to L1. And fundamentally, I see this as kind of like the freedom of movement for your L2 assets, right? And this is very much the same as kind of what we were talking about earlier with a bearer asset on Ethereum where I can send it and I know no one in the world can stop me from sending it. In the same way, if I have an asset on an L2 and that L2 has this forced inclusion mechanism, I know that I have that same right, which is even if the L2 starts censoring me, even if all of the L2 operators collude against me and decide like, I want to steal that guy's money, they are not able to do so. I can bridge my money down to the L1 and kind of take my assets elsewhere. So those are kind of like the core ways that I see L2s as inheriting Ethereum's security and Ethereum's censorship resistance. Now, kind of,
and therefore property rights, like those two things come together as like, okay, Ethereum is offering assurances on property rights.
Yeah, exactly. And so given that, now I think the L2s have like a more flexible design space over how they provide users what kind of the daily users want beyond those two core things, which is fast transactions, good onboarding, offboarding, and very low fees. Yeah, the sexy stuff, right? So, you know, as a user, I could be a lot more comfortable knowing that like most of my activity is going to happen on the L2, so long as I know I still have my like core self-sovereignty over the assets themselves. And I think, you know, in the long run, that's going to be very important because some L2s that don't inherit the security of Ethereum are going to end up with decreased property rights for their assets. And this actually happened already, right, on Blast. So there was a hack on Blast. Everyone talks about it as if it was a good thing. And I think it's kind of a blessing and a curse, but this Munchables protocol got hacked for $60 million. And, you know, they basically communicated with the hacker and said, hey, we're going to update the contract and take away your money, and they just sent it back. And so it's kind of like, okay, this is a weird dystopian end game where we're like doing this hostage negotiation through Etherscan, but that just doesn't feel like an actual like thing that should be able to happen if I'm using an L2 and I'm trusting the L2 to kind of I'm only trusting the L2 to provide me the nice stuff. I'm not trusting it to provide me the core stuff, the core property rights and censorship resistance that Ethereum is going to give me.
So currently, let's say, do layer 2s provide the same property rights as Ethereum's layer 1 block space? You kept using this phrase, stage 2. And of course, if people want to understand what that means, they can go to L2Beat, which tracks kind of the stage progress of all of these layer 2s. And the case that you just mentioned, Mike, with Blast is basically stage 0. Okay,
yes.
So like along its decentralization journey. So it has the ability, does not have the property rights of the Ethereum mainnet, has the ability to censor, has the ability to kind of like freeze in some respects. But all of these layer 2s should be on a journey towards full stage 2, which imbues them with property rights that are similar, maybe not equal to, but pretty similar to the guarantees of Ethereum layer 1 block space. Now, there's a few things we could get into there in terms of like some people doubt whether layer 2s will actually ever get to stage 2. Others don't think that stage 2 actually imbues the same level of property rights as Ethereum layer 1. But let's park on this for a second. Can we define what exactly stage 2 actually means and how a layer 2 achieves that, and whether any of these are close?
Stage 2 is fundamentally asking the question of what does it take to change the L1 contract that represents the view of the L2 according to the bridge on Ethereum's L1.
Said differently, is it like stage 2 is like what kind of control does the Ethereum layer 1 have over the Ethereum layer 2?
More like what type of control do people in the real world have over the bridge that represents the state of the L2?
Right.
So, right now, basically, being able to upgrade that contract is essentially the equivalent of being able to play God, right? Like if you bridge your assets into that contract and then someone just upgrades the contract to send all the assets to their own account, then your property is gone, right? And that's something that is kind of like fundamentally broken about having contracts that are upgradable. At least upgradable in the sense that they are now. So Vitalik kind of laid out what preconditions need to be met in order for a contract upgrade to happen. One of those preconditions is you have multiple client implementations that disagree on the state given the same set of transactions. So this is kind of like using the multi-client approach to say, hey, if there's a bug and we don't actually know what the new state is, like then we defer back to a security council where they can upgrade the contract. And so this is almost kind of like a worst case scenario fallback mechanism to save everyone's assets if the bridge is giving wrong results. He also lays out some ideas around like if the rollup goes offline for 7 days, then you kind of this is kind of like the rollup is stuck. It's no longer live. You need to kind of grant access back to the bridge operators, to the people who run the actual rollup to upgrade the contract. And then I guess the third bullet point he lists in there is that upgrades can happen, but only after like a long delay, such as 30 days. And the idea here is that any sort of long delay like this would offer the rollup consumers time to decide if they're going to bridge out or keep their assets in that L1 contract, right? So fundamentally, I like have this choice where it's like, I see the upgrade happening. Maybe they're going back to stage 0. Maybe they're going back to blast mode of operation. I don't think I'm comfortable with that, so I'm going to do my exit. And they give me like 30 days to kind of inform myself and make that decision. So obviously, like in some ways, this isn't purely the same as being able to just like lock away your ETH and not touch it for 20 years and then wake up and move it kind of trustlessly. But I think the level of property rights that you can get at stage 2 are so close that it'll be like, equivalent in many regards and enough for people to trust using the L2s fully.
So yeah, this whole like stage 0, stage 1, stage 2 thing, and also if we opened up layer 2B and we looked at all the pie slices that are either red, orange, or green, these are all measures of an individual's property rights on this layer 2. And so like whether a layer 2 is at stage 0 or stage 2 is a statement about how strong one's property rights are on this thing. And then you can, again, you look at the pie slices, and if they're all green, then like your property rights as an individual are like pretty damn strong. If they're all red, then your property rights as an individual are pretty all weak. But all of this is under this North Star umbrella of just like evaluating property rights across this layered stack, right?
the bridge upgradability and the stage 2, stage 1, stage 0 stuff we were just talking about is kind of imbuing seizure resistance to L2 assets. Now, there's another very important thing to consider, which is actually censorship resistance of those assets, right? So the path here is I have some ETH on Ethereum mainnet, and I bridge it into the contract. And now I'm operating on the L2, but the only person who's able to sequence L2 transactions is a centralized entity. And they decide that they don't want to process my withdrawal request. Like I have 10 Ether in there and I want to withdraw it, and I send them the transaction and they just drop it. They ignore it. Now, the way that rollups are designed to protect those assets and to give back that censorship resistance of the L1 is this idea of a forced transaction inclusion mechanism. So this is called different things on the different stacks, but the idea is the same, which is I can post a transaction to the L1 and know that even if the L2 sequencer ignores me and continues to ignore me, as long as that transaction lands on the L1, my withdrawal will get processed and I can take my Ether out. And so this is kind of the fundamental protection against any arbitrary sequencer ignoring my wishes and kind of censoring me on that access. So kind of with these two things combined, the stage 2 trust or stage 2 ability to trust that the contract can't get arbitrarily upgraded, and with the guarantee that I can always land a transaction on the L1 that will bridge my assets out from the L2 contract, I have such bulletproof properties for my assets in the L2 that they're functionally equivalent to assets on the L1.
Mike, do you have a doubt that layer 2s will actually achieve stage 2? So this is something that Max said, basically, that's not incentive compatible. They don't have the kind of the motivation because it sort of destroys a MEV revenue model for them. It was interesting that I saw recently that Vitalik is kind of applying some social pressure to layer 2s and tweeting out that he's not going to be talking about layer 2s unless I think they achieve stage 2. Is it stage 1 or above? Like something to this effect. They're getting closer to stage
1
2.
And above. Yeah.
Okay, so it's 1 and above. So, and at some point you can imagine Vitalik saying, "Hey, I'm not going to talk about you until it's stage 2." So that's social pressure, but it's I guess a bit of a stick take, and it's he can't compel them to do this. So what about Max's take that L2s aren't going to actually move towards stage 2? So that would be nice if the reality you said was true, but it's just not going to happen.
So yeah, this is actually a really common misconception, which is stage 2 doesn't say anything necessarily about the decentralization of the sequencer itself, right? So stage 2 has this component of how can you upgrade the contract, and this forced transaction inclusion mechanism is about what happens if the sequencer is censoring you. But the actual decentralization of the sequencer is kind of deprioritized in this stack ranking of things. And Vitalik actually mentioned this specifically in the recent Reddit AMA, which is to say, it's fine if the sequencer is still centralized, is still collecting MEV, and this is kind of more of a question around how can the sequencers compete to give the best execution to the users? Because fundamentally, the users are going to vote with their feet and they're going to choose whatever gives them the best execution. But the kind of important thing is that all of these sequencers compete on the same level playing field of they give the same property rights to the assets underlying those transactions. So yeah, I actually fully agree with Max when he said, there's no incentive for the L2s to decentralize their sequencer. I kind of agree with him. Fundamentally, a big part of how I view their business model, and I think you guys have said this before, is they're kind of reselling block space, right? They're marking it up. They're providing goods and services that make it more consumable for the average user. But fundamentally, they have to make a profit somehow. And I think the sequencer is a natural way for them to make a profit. And the ultimate decision around which L2 to use will come down to which L2 can provide the best features for the users, not which L2 can provide the best property rights. Yeah. So I like to think about it as as long as they all have the same kind of core fundamental security, then the kind of extra add-ons are what they should actually be competing on.
So you're agreeing with Max in that you're saying that the incentives to decentralize the sequencer are simply just not there, but you're also making a kind of a broader point, a higher level point, which is that, well, decentralizing the sequencer is actually not a core condition that we need to have our rollups be set for. That's not a bad benchmark to compare to, because actually just maybe we're actually kind of just conflating this idea of, I know like centralization is kind of a bad word in our industry. And like, why don't you want to decentralize the sequencer, bro? Like, why do you not like decentralization? Like, are you a centralization maxi? Maybe you can kind of unpack this take a little bit. Like, decentralizing the sequencer, like important, not important. Like, why do we want this? Why don't we want this? Unpack that take a little bit.
Yeah, this is kind of maybe a personal opinion, but in my mind, sequencers should be centralized because they rely on Ethereum for decentralization. So like, why would a sequencer kind of double down on the thing that Ethereum's already best at, which is providing strong property rights, instead of kind of working in a more symbiotic way and kind of doing what Ethereum's not willing to do, which is be fast, be slightly more centralized, and offer people better user experiences, and kind of like merge those two things to make the most kind of complete full flow of interacting with these systems. So yeah, I guess Max in his podcast, we're picking on him a lot, but I think it's worth going through. You know, he basically said, "Oh, we already have like permissionless consensus. Like the L2s should just run a proof of stake network, and that's like how they should naturally decentralize their sequencers." But I don't think that actually makes that much sense, because basically what this involves is taking away some of the core value add features that the L2s have in the first place, which is like, you can give 200 millisecond, confirmations. Like that's just not possible if you have to do permissionless consensus. And the level of permissionless consensus kind of, no matter what, would be worse than the consensus that's actually taking place on Ethereum, right? So it's like you're trying to do what Ethereum's doing, but you're doing it at a worse level. And to what ends? Because you're not actually giving people better kind of long-term property rights and store value properties for their assets. I think he would say here that like maybe we're giving them better real-time censorship resistance, and I think there is a world where maybe that's worth exploring. But kind of from a first principles perspective, I don't see why decentralize the sequencer in the kind of near term is actually something that needs to happen.
Yeah. So I think what you're doing is you're kind of just stacking the idea of a decentralized layer 2 sequencer set is like one of the many things that all of our layer 2s are all going to compete on. And to whatever degree that having a decentralized sequencer set is valuable for the users, is valuable for the block space of that layer 2, is something that layer 2 can compete on. But there's also nothing fundamentally wrong with having a single sequencer. In fact, all of the technology around optimistic rollups and fraud proofs and ZK rollups is all about enabling a centralized sequencer set without compromising individuals' property rights who use a centralized sequencer. It's actually kind of just like you can actually have your centralization, but have all the benefits of a decentralized network that is keeping that centralized entity in check. Would you agree with that vibe?
Yeah, exactly.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.